Hello there! One of the cooler things for lore lovers like me about Magic the Gathering is when the story and the cards perfectly converge. Look at Ghostfire. This red damage dealing spell is apparently colourless, and when we read, we learn it's because it comes from some sort of spirit dragon, whatever that might be. Years later, we see the spirit dragon, and he can do many things. The thing he really likes to do though, is the exact same thing depicted on that card. This to me strikes a great balance between making interesting cards that do interesting things, and making the story and characters in the game feel cohesive and well thought out. Magic is poised to return to Zendikar, a plane we visited in 5 previous sets, and I thought it would be fun to grade how well the legendary people and places on Zendikar synergize between their cards and their place in the story. Sometimes mechanics and gameplay have to win out, and that'll lead to weird situations, like using pin to earth on a flying creature, but the creature still has flying even though it's been pinned to the earth. Or the fact that Guardian of Cloverdale's card actually has it butchers the very thing its flavor says it's most protective of. Sometimes the game comes ahead of the flavor, but when both work together to embetter the other, it's a pretty special thing. So, grading scales. A's are perfect synergy between form and function. B's are cards that do a good job, but leave some key details behind in the transition from story to cardboard. C's are cards that at least don't actively get in their own way. D's are cards that do actively get in their own way, and F's are ones that just don't function at all or are a huge mess. With all that preamble out of the way, you're listening to Building Better Dungeons. Let's see every legendary permanent that ever came out of Zendikar. Alright. Anawan, the Ruin Sage. Anawan was a vampire scholar whose life is surrounded by mystery. From the outside, it would appear that this card is appropriate enough. When Anawan is near, people die in mysterious circumstances while he hunts for ancient secrets in far-off temples. In reality, Anawan's first murder was that of the vampire that sired him, and this card makes no reference to his scholarly pursuit of knowledge, and in fact has him hurting non-vampire creatures. So I think it has to be a D. Anawan is fine, but the card and the character aren't really a good fit for each other at all. Ailee, Eternal Pilgrim. This card is pretty bizarre. Death Touch usually implies a special battlefield ruthlessness or an affinity for poisons, and it is out of place here on Ailee, who as far as we know has neither. Ailee was a worshipper of the Eldrazi, great gods imprisoned on Zendikar, and this worship involved ritual sacrifice. She appears on the flavor text of several cards, and we get a sense through these cards that though she views sacrifice as a tool worth using, it is for lofty ends, for worship, and to protect her people throughout the generations. When the Eldrazi were released, and the great broods of horrific monsters were unleashed upon the land, Ailee's devotion didn't wane, it only grew. It's unclear why she gains the power to exile permanents with her sacrifices when you've gained enough life. Like, what's the life doing there? And it's doubly unclear why this would allow her to actually exile the very Eldrazi she's worshipping. Ailee might be a D, I mean not quite an F, but you'd get a very weird impression of her from the card that doesn't match up with the story at all. The lore and mechanical identities are not in harmony. Drana. Drana is the first character on our list with more than one card. As her character develops throughout the story, she's given another card to represent her new position. Drana, Calastria Bloodchief, shows her as a person in charge of one of the many families of vampires that rules the vampire city of Malakir. Her ability is flavorful enough. In a slightly generic way for vampires, she can drain the life force of other creatures to temporarily give herself more power. However, when the vile Kalatas, who we'll see later, threatens to turn each of the vampires on Malakir into thralls for those Eldrazi gods, Drana steps up to lead the vampires to freedom and liberation, and then goes on to ally with the forces of Zendikar that oppose the Eldrazi. Here, her vampiric tendencies are almost irrelevant, so they get sidelined. What we see is Drana leading from the front, striking first with First Strike, and empowering her allies when she does so. Drana gets, I think, an easy A. Her cards show her at 2 different stages of life, and they do so simply and effectively. Congratulations, Drana. Emrakul, the Eons Torn. Emrakul is the first of the Eldrazi we'll see today, and the least relevant to Zendikar. The story of the Eldrazi is an interesting one. Twisted monstrosities beyond comprehension, the Eldrazi are not on Zendikar by mere accident. Long ago, 3 powerful mages with the power to walk between worlds noticed these titans beyond reason, destroying world after world with their ravenous and insatiable appetite. The 3 worked together to transform Zendikar into the perfect trap that would bind such monstrosities. And that plan worked. The most powerful of all the Eldrazi, Emrakul twists flesh and organic matter into grim facsimiles of themselves. She flies by some trick of gravity distortion, and she is simply too massive, too powerful to be affected by much of anything. That's why she can't be countered. and she's immune to most effects the colors of magic could summon against her. She boggles the mind and defies reality itself, giving you an extra turn, and when she attacks, there can be no perfect defense. The Annihilator keyword means that the opponents must sacrifice permanents as she devastates the battlefield. She shares a line of text here with her other Eldrazi fellows. Whenever she is put into the graveyard, she is simply shuffled back into your library, becoming a problem once again in the future. This mirrors how the Eldrazi actually could not be conventionally destroyed, only forced out of planes, where they might return to attack at a later date. All in all, I think Emrakul is an A. Each line of text lends her gravitas, and the last ability is a wonderful merge of flavor and function. You can't kill Emrakul, and you can't kill the Eldrazi, because both might come back later. What you need to do, what the Planeswalkers who bound Emrakul and the other Eldrazi Titans to Zendikar figured, is lock them down somehow, imprison them. Emrakul feels like an impossible monster in every sense of the word, so yeah, easy A. The Eye of Ugen. The Eye of Ugen is what those three Planeswalkers, those walkers between the worlds, used as the nexus of their trap to bind the Eldrazi. And its card here is bizarre, because its passive ability makes it easier to call Eldrazi to the battlefield, and its activated ability lets you draw huge creatures near. I suppose that these are in reference to the Eye's use as a lure to get the Eldrazi on Zendikar in the first place, but it's strange that the Eldrazi prison doesn't imprison the Eldrazi or anything like them. This device made to ensnare the Eldrazi instead enables them. It seems at cross purposes with itself. So the best I can give it is a D. I mean, yeah, if you know the lore already, you can justify why it does what it does, but how close are you to getting the correct impression as a new player? You're pretty far off. General Tazeri! Tazeri's story is more interesting than you might think from her card. Cursed after mercy killing a fallen angel, that's the halo there in her art, Tazeri's initial role in the story is almost antagonistic, skeptical of help from unfamiliar sources, and more willing to retreat than fight. She's a kind of ally champion on this card, and allies are an interesting little thing all their own. Initially they were there to represent the kind of camaraderie that Explorer parties and Dungeons & Dragons characters enjoy. But when the Eldrazi ravaged Zendikar, allies took on a second meaning, the forces of Zendikar who came together to oppose them. Tazeri started off reticent, but the character we see on the card is the one who rallies the forces after Kozilek, another Eldrazi Titan's Great Distortion shatters the resolve of the allies. Tazeri is the one who brings the previously mentioned Drana and Noyandar, a royal mage, and we'll get to that later. She brings these two back into the fight after both are incapacitated, so her ability to fetch you allies is very appropriate. When on the battlefield, Tazeri can benefit from allies, but not just the number of them, but more the variety in their tactical capabilities and philosophies. Even when she had only a single royal mage, she managed to use her other allies in her army to lend him power to get the job done. So it's actually very appropriate that Tazeri benefits from having a variety of different types of allies on her side, different colors, as opposed to just a number. I think she's a solid A, and a lot of fun to boot. Iona, Shield of Emeria. Iona brings us to one of the cooler details on Zendikar's lore. It's angels. Angels in Magic the Gathering in general are created, not born, as a natural effect of white mana existing on planes. It tends to coalesce into angelic forms, the same way that black mana coalesces into demonic ones. Angels are enforcers of white ideals, equality, purity, all that good stuff. Unsurprisingly, the angels on Zendikar fought against the original Eldrazi incursions, and unsurprisingly they were summarily defeated. In a move that was a little on the nose actually, the Eldrazi corrupted the angels, forcing their halos to cover their eyes and leave them blind to the Eldrazi's destruction. Over time, those halos became seen as a sign of impartiality and justice, but some archangels never had their eyes blinded. Iona is one of those, and her ability is as powerful as it gets, forbidding opponents from using spells of a chosen color to hurt the righteous. Unfortunately though, the Eldrazi are colorless, so Iona's ability is useless against the very threatening Zendikar. Just as in lore, she finds herself incapable of really making a dent in the Eldrazi incursion, despite her immense power. Yeah, that's a really nice, that's just poetry. Iona gets an A. Jorian, Ruin Diver. Jorian is a merfolk who dives into ruins to find ancient information. She helps Jace solve the mystery of Zendikar's ley lines and figure out that the source of the strange Eldrazi disturbance was the Eye of Ugen, which we talked about already. Her card here is a little generic. It's unclear what any of this really means in a storytelling perspective. Jori's most captivating moment in the story is when she dives into the deepest, murkiest caverns to get the legendary Kiora, who we'll discuss later, her powerful Bident back. The ability to fetch or interact with artifacts is solely missing on this card. But it's fine, and it does evoke a kind of researchy, spelunky character that Jorian is. So I think that's just the archetypal C. Could be more specific, but it's not getting in its own way. Kalatas. Kalatas is another character with 2 cards, and he started off as the chief of the lowest vampire families on Malakir, the Get, and eventually he opened his heart to the Eldrazi, offering his family as mindless thralls. We see that poverty, humiliation, and degradation have made Kalatas feel disconnected and uninvested in the world around him. His vampire house is the lowest of all of them, and they meet open scorn constantly. They're the least important, they have a bad time. If his lot in life were better, then maybe he wouldn't have been so eager to throw in with the Eldrazi in the first place. His first card, before his corruption, showcases his vampiric ability to destroy foes and replace them with vampires under his command. His second showcases his ability to create nulls, zombies made when all the blood is drained from a victim. Like the Eldrazi he serves, he becomes less invested in champions and individuals and more interested in leading and gaining strength from a swarm. Nothing direct or clean enough here to really warrant an A, but I think Kalatas is a solid B. Kazul, Tyrant of the Cliffs. So Kazul seems at first to be a miss, because he's the owner of cliffs and his flavor text talks about tossing people off of cliffs, but his card is about ogres or payment or something. But when you look into the lore, you find that Kazul is a slave driver that only allows those willing to pay to pass his path. Otherwise, they're met with an armed resistance. In this way, the card is actually pretty excellent. Can you pay Kazul's bribe? If not, I hope you can handle the slaves he forces to stand in your way. I am hesitant to give Kazul an A because a new player is probably going to be quite confused as to why there's no tossing off cliffs on the card. But it is a really flavorful rendition of the actual character. I just kind of wish that they had leaned more into the actual cool side of him, you know, forcing payment, being a toll master, as opposed to the cliffs thing, which isn't really on the card. I guess that's a B. I mean, what's good is good, but what's bad is also a little bit bad. Ah, Kazul, you were so close. Kiora, Master of the Depths. Woo boy! So we have our first Planeswalker. Lots of Planeswalkers had their first card on Zendikar actually. We're only going to discuss characters that actually came from Zendikar in the lore. Because have you seen the runtime of this video? And we'll only discuss their cards on Zendikar. So, here is Kiora, a merfolk who really enjoys big sea monsters. That really is her defining characteristic. Interestingly, in Mark Rosewater's Need I Say Core? Mark, why do you do this to me? Article, he gave an interesting piece of information. Planeswalker abilities correspond, at least somewhat, to how much they like doing whatever the ability does. In that case, he was talking about a Ajani, who didn't like destroying or dealing with creatures, but could do it, so it actually cost him loyalty. He'd prefer to be gaining you life or something instead, but in a pinch he'll do the destruction. You can notice a similar paradigm actually with Chandra, who because of the time spent with her girlfriend, don't at me, Nissa, over time goes from giving you card advantage on negative loyalty abilities, meaning she doesn't like it so much, to giving you that card advantage on positive ones, showing that she's becoming more interested in learning and planning over time. Here, we see Kiora is happy to untap permanents, and what that means in gameplay is that she's letting you use things that tap for mana multiple times, so you can cast your big behemoths more easily. From a flavor point of view, I suppose that means she enjoys letting you prepare for the arrival of all sorts of big beasties, which is quite nice. She's a little less invested in actually finding them though, which is kind of typical for Kiora's character. She doesn't have a huge amount of follow through. She abandons things pretty easily in the story. And then when we look at her final ability, her ultimate, she summons 3 colossal octopuses to fight on your behalf. And that takes so much out of her that she immediately has to scram to take a nap. Planeswalker cards need to do a different job than many of the other cards we've discussed today. They actually have to sell us on a recurring character. So Kiora's doesn't really do much to talk about what she gets up to in the story of Zendikar, but it does establish her character perfectly, so I'm happy giving it an A, judging it on slightly different criteria. This is who Kiora is, and all her later cards, and all the later cards that relate to her, show that this kind of preparation for big monsters, helping you dig for big monsters, is really all Kiora's into. Core Haven. This legendary land isn't actually on Zendikar proper, it was reprinted in Zendikar's Expeditions. The card actually comes from the set Nemesis, showing the haven for the core on the plane of Wrath. Zendikar's core are actually famously nomadic. They have several sacred sites, and not one in particular, so this card just gets an F. It shouldn't have been reprinted. I know it kind of wasn't, but it shouldn't have been even given Zendikar art. So we're just going to move on to Kozilek, Butcher of Truth, the Great Distortion. So we've already talked about Eldrazi when we chatted about Emrakul, and here is Kozilek, the Eldrazi Titan of Distortion, Panic, Confusion, Deception, all that good stuff. His original card is a bit of a letdown. It's got that great text about shuffling into the library instead of dying that all the original big Eldrazi had, but the drawing of cards and the Annihilator are more generic than inspiring. His Great Distortion card does a much better job. Drawing you up to 7 cards is a little generic still, but his ability to discard cards to counter spells is perfect at showing the strange reality torting abilities that Kozilek has. Simply discarding possible realities to foil actual ones is a beautifully warped and twisted display of his power. Kozilek's older card probably warrants a B at best if he's lucky, but his new shiny form is an easy A, and I'm happy as to how many A's I'm able to give so far. Then we have Linvala, the Preserver and Keeper of Silence. We've already seen Iona, but Linvala, the other Zendikar angel we'll be talking about today, is really a phenomenal piece of work. In the Keeper of Silence card, like many angels, she forbids your opponents from doing things. In this case, silencing opposing creatures by preventing them from using their abilities. This is doubly perfect because of the Eldrazi spawn tokens, which many Eldrazi create. Cards that can sacrifice themselves to add mana that you can use to cast those expensive titans more easily. Linvala cuts them down to size, preventing them from summoning their masters and rendering them as next to useless. She's the perfect opponent for Eldrazi. Her later card isn't quite as excellent, simply catching you up on life and on creatures if you're behind on either. This expresses her greater fervor in helping the weak and downtrodden, where most Zendikar angels would turn a blind eye, but it's not as strong as her original card from a flavor point of view. Still, the overall package puts Linvala at another easy A, mostly carried by how excellently the Keeper of Silence card marries form and function to incredible detail. Lorthos, the Tide Maker. Lorthos is a big octopus who is feared because his many tentacles can grab and drag adventurers to their doom. Look at how resonant this guy is. An 8 mana 8/8 that lets you tap 8 things if you pay 8 mana, that's just perfect. This ability is clearly him using his 8 tentacles to constrict up to 8 targets, and I love it. In the gameplay, this actually deals with Eldrazi just fine, but in the lore, Kiora must not have had the 8 mana to pay, because when she summons Lorthos to fight Kozilek, the latter just cuts him in half. Still, this is the perfect octopus. You get an A+ Lorthos. Please return one of my calls. Lorthos, I thought what we had was Mina and Den, Wildborn. Whatever's happening here, I don't get it. Mina and Den are 2 brothers from a tribe of elves almost entirely destroyed by the Eldrazi, and in the course of defending themselves from Eldrazi monsters, Mina learns she can speak to the earth and listen to her ancestors. In her story, she summons the land power to heal her brother, create vines that protect them from Eldrazi noise, toss the earth itself, and gain strength beyond her physical ability. The card is a lot more generic than that though. It doesn't really get in its own way, but almost nothing here speaks at all to the actual events that are in the story the 2 take part in. I think that's a straight C. The best I can say about it is that it doesn't trip over itself. Mundo, Ambush Leader. Mundo was a core line leader that happily coordinated the disparate core voices and forces into a cohort that the allies could use to protect Zendikar. He is eager for battle, but not foolish, retreating when it is wise to, and his triggered ability speaks to his talent at rallying troops and bringing allies to his side. Allies. Mundo is simple, and much is left out of his card. He's not as hasty or as rash as you might believe, and none of his talent as a slinger is here. I think Mundo works best as a B. Nissa. Nissa is a Zendikar native, and interestingly actually underwent a retcon. Originally an Elves Matter kind of planeswalker who's a bit of an elf supremacist, the new Nissa has been retroactively made into an animist, a summoner of elementals and a speaker of the land. That's the thing that her second card does quite well. She loves to animate elementals, and look at her, she's animating a bunch of plants for you there. And she's less of a fan of empowering your allies. Maybe she'd be more into it if she didn't have the chance to accidentally empower some of your non-plant or elementals there. If you were a bit more restrictive, maybe she'd be a bit happier to do it. Her ultimate rewards you for playing lands, and Nissa does indeed love a land. Most of her other Planeswalker cards directly have to do with lands in their animation. Her history on Zendikar is a bit of a mess from her earlier, now retconned elf supremacist days, but she's crystallized here into a much firmer direction as an animist Planeswalker, and that card does a fine job of portraying it. A bit of a mixed package, but I think it's solid B. Noyandar, Royal Shaper. Noyandar is actually a lovely character to talk about, because before he was ever featured on a card, he was quoted on lots of them. As a lull mage, he would quiet Zendikar's volatile landscape, and was often featured being rude, arrogant, and a poor sport on cards like counterspells. I mean, seriously, look at this, he's such a jerk. Such a jerk. Such a jerk. But when the Eldrazi rolled into town, he realized his talents were actually better spent directing Zendikar's fury at its invaders instead of quelling it. Even the instant and sorcery trigger makes sense. We see Noyan use magic from other sources to power his own in the Zendikar stories, and transforming your lands into creatures is a perfect translation of his talents from his page to the table. Noyan gets an A, and he's one of the characters I'm most excited to see return in Zendikar Rising. Oaths. One of the really interesting and deeply controversial things that happens on Zendikar is that some of the planeswalkers defending it from the Eldrazi form a group called the Gatewatch, dedicated to protecting the multiverse. It's very nice. Each character's oath is given its own card, which does something when it enters the battlefield, and likes it when you've got planeswalkers. Jace's draws you cards, and Scry's if you have planeswalkers. That Jace is a blue mage, and he likes drawing cards and scrying, so that's good for him. Gideon's makes you some soldiers and gives your planeswalkers a boost in loyalty. Gideon does like soldiers. Chandra's burns something and then burns your opponent if you have planeswalkers, and Chandra does love to burn things. And Nissa, who we just talked about, can find you more planeswalkers, creatures, or lands, and lets you cast your planeswalkers more easily. Each matches okay with the character in question, except perhaps for Nissa, whose skittishness and shyness really should not be letting her bring other planeswalkers to the table more easily. The oaths are all quite simple, and none are really all that evocative of what their characters do until we get later oaths released in later sets. So I'm saying that all these boys get a C. They don't trip over themselves, but from a flavor point of view, none of them are the home run that I think the creative team wanted them to be. Obnixlus. Obnixlus was a massive jerk and idiot who was cursed into being a demon because he was such a jerk and idiot, and then lost his spark, he was a planeswalker, to Zendikar's chaotic mana, trapping him there. He then swore revenge against the plane itself, which is exactly like a 4-year-old swearing revenge against the ground after dropping his own ice cream cone. I don't exactly get what his original card is doing. Perhaps this is him siphoning power from the lands of Zendikar, which never really happens. I mean, I would give it a D, really, because we don't see him do any of this. But eventually he siphons enough power to get his spark back, and that's a good thing too, because his Planeswalker card is a good bit better. Obnixlus likes causing pain. His plus ability has him hurt you as he helps you, and his minus ability lets him destroy another creature. We can tell from his decision to torture, not kill, the planeswalkers he captures in the story, that he'd rather cause pain than death, which is why that's a minus ability. His ultimate is a delightful twist of the knife, forcing your opponents to hurt themselves as they draw cards. Obnixlus is an A, and a damn sight better than his other card. Omnath. A fan favourite, especially for those commander players, Omnath has expanded into quite the fun character over the years. There isn't really much lore on Omnath. A divine manifestation of Zendikar's chaotic mana, Omnath is a being of pure magic, one that many pilgrims and ritualists would work tirelessly twice a year to contain in his prison on Ondu. However, the events in the lead up to the rise of the Eldrazi disrupted the ritual, freeing Omnath, and ever since he's escaped, he's been as chaotic as the plane itself. The first Omnath is a perfect manifestation of being made of mana, allowing you to keep mana indefinitely and growing stronger the more of it is kept in your pool. The second Omnath shows his rage and the anger of Zendikar itself, at the destruction the Eldrazi have wrought, now incorporating red mana into itself. Omnath creates powerful elementals from the roiling land of Zendikar, and as those elemental dies, he unleashes their anger too. The third Omnath didn't actually come from Zendikar, it came from a core set, but we'll include it for completeness sake. Having calmed down somewhat, this Omnath has adopted blue mana, and is less in tune with mana and more in tune with the elemental themselves. Blue, red, and green have long been the elemental colours, and this Omnath has a single controlled blast, fueled by other elementals, before he empowers them and you with the land itself. Omnath is essentially a perfect design. I mean, he gets an easy A+. There isn't a lot of lore for him to contradict, and the cards that are there are very evocative. What's more, art of the new Omnath in Zendikar Rising has surfaced, and those white wisps are indicative that Omnath might be adding yet another colour to his repertoire, and I'm excited to see how that turns out. Zada Adel, Acquisitor. Zada Adel isn't in the story. TukTuk, the Explorer. TukTuk was a foolish explorer who died in a tomb, and then his mind became trapped in a golem. He returned to his tribe and taught goblins they could become stronger by eating hedrons, magical rocks, that were a part of the Eldrazi trap set by those planeswalkers we talked about. His card is simple, his low stats relative to his cost shows his stupidity and ineptitude, and his death trigger shows that he dies and then returns. I don't really know how this could be improved. It's not like super evocative, but it is excellent at being the thing that it is, so I guess that's an A. Zada, Hedron Grinder. Zada can eat stones to unleash the magic inside of them, and she actually devoured TukTuk, which is kind of awful, Zada, Jesus Christ. Eating all of his delicious power and keeping it for herself. This has, as far as I can see, straight up nothing to do with the card. This is so mystifying, I don't even know if I can call it an F. It's just, what's happening here? Absolutely nothing on her card has anything to do with the thing in the story. You've no way of knowing what Zada is like at all. I mean, she's a literal cannibal for Christ's sake. F. Ulamog, infinite gyre and ceaseless hunger. Last of the Eldrazi Titans, and smallest of them, both in flavor and in terms of stats. That's extra credit, Ulamog. Ulamog's probably the cleanest in terms of lore. The Titan of Hunger, Consumption, and Plague, he's got that great return to library clause in his original card, and when cast, he destroys a permanent of your choice. He just eats it up. He's got that same Annihilator clause the other Eldrazi Titans have. He's just a hungry, hungry boy all around. But by the time we get to his second incarnation, it was decided that when an Eldrazi eats something, it should be exiled. Not in your graveyard. The idea is that when an Eldrazi eats you, there's just nothing left. Now, Ulamog exiles 2 permanents of your choice when he enters the battlefield. Hungrier than ever before, but that's not all. When he attacks, he exiles 20 cards of your opponent's libraries. That is one deeply hungry boy who wants the big dinner. You might have noticed that his newer card, like Kozilek, ditches the when this card hits the graveyard, shuffle into your library shtick that the Eldrazi all had in their original incarnations. Emrakul actually properly just left, so she didn't get a second card, and Kozilek and Ulamog's second cards actually shows them after they were properly drawn fully into Zendikar by the Gatewatch's shenanigans. Usually only a sliver of the Eldrazi's true form is on any one plane, but the Gatewatch successfully dragged both Titans onto Zendikar so they could be destroyed completely and utterly. Now, they're both considerably more powerful than their original incarnations, but they lack that recursion ability, which is just mwah, chef's kiss. Overall, Ulamog gets an A+, just a pitch-perfect rendition of a terrible monstrosity. Rexiel, the Risen Deep. Rexiel has next to no lore, B for the general concept of an evil kraken master. Yarok, the Desecrated. Into the home stretch now. None of these cards actually came from sets on Zendikar, they're just characters from Zendikar that appeared in supplemental products. Yarok is from a core set, a sort of beginner set meant to introduce magic to newbies. Yarok is the elemental incarnation of Bala Ged, which is a continent on Zendikar that just completely got wrecked by Ulamog's hunger. Yarok's card and 3 other cards from his same set contain a poem which serves as Yarok's entire flavor text. Yarok grieves within the waste of Bala Ged's corrupted land. Yarok's waters rush in rage where armies bled into the sand. Yarok's nightmares lurk and wait where dark despair is near at hand. Grief and rage and nightmares fade, where hope and comfort make their stand. Yarok's card might seem like it has absolutely nothing to do with anything, and you're kind of right, but Yarok makes the landfall triggers that happen quite often on Zendikar trigger twice, so it's kind of like something about reclamation and attenuating regrowth. That's a bit of a stretch, but you know, we'll go with a C. Ryami, First of the Fallen. Vampires are an interesting kettle of fish in Magic the Gathering. They actually have disparate sources and origin stories on each plane. They're not like angels or demons, which occur naturally. They usually have to be made by circumstance. You won't be surprised to hear that the Eldrazi had something to do with it this time. Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger, corrupted the minds of those who lived near the Eye of Ugen, and soon those cultists performed rituals to try and free the Eldrazi. Of those cultists, only 12 survived, and they became the 12 Blood Chiefs who'd rule the vampire city of Malakir. Ryami is one of the first 12, and his card is a pretty generic vampire. He gains strength from enemies. But the exiling is a nice touch, because it helps you solidify him as an Eldrazi-aligned force, because they're so in tune with exile. Fun visual fact, you can always tell when a vampire is from Zendikar because they have those shoulder horns. Regardless, I think Ryami is about a C. It doesn't really make too much sense when you think about it. That's not really how vampirism works, but it doesn't really get it its own way too badly, and it's kind of cool, so power to you, Ryami. Sword of the Animist. I like this card, folks, but it really confuses me. Nissa has a staff sword, and it's not one that's implied to be special in any way. It's certainly not gifted by the plane of Zendikar or anything. The sword does Zendikar things, it ramps your lands when it's used by creatures, but the fact that the little flavor we have directly contradicts the lore, and it's just straight up incorrect. We can equip this card to a variety of creatures who are not Zendikar's chosen, actually. So I think we just gotta give this one an F. I love having the card in all my non-green EDH decks, but it's just not doing much for me from a flavor point of view. Kiri! Kiri was a part of a scavenging band of Kor, but was forced to strike out on her own when the Eldrazi murdered all of her comrades. She dedicated herself to protecting travelers from the likes of Ulamog, a powerful force of destruction, using her expertise with ropes and hooks to get people where they needed to go. Akiri's first strike and vigilance are expressions of her belief in self-reliance and preparation, and this is reflected in her static ability too. The more tools you've brought to the battlefield, the better Akiri is in combat, and because of her ability keywords, the combat prowess is both offensive and defensive and is suited to keeping her alive. That's actually a lot of good flavor coming out of just some basic keywords there, so I quite like that. But all I can really give her is a B, because she does lose some points for not protecting other creatures or not getting them where they need to go. I mean, that's almost all she does in the lore, but oh well. Bruce Tarl! Bruce Tarl! Something of an old joke on Zendikar, Bruce and his colourful insults were quoted long before he ever appeared in the card, and I think this card works at least partially. When the powerful Eldrazi threatened the safety of his herd, Bruce gathered a team together to fight them off, and he did that successfully many times. That organizational talent and willingness to work with anyone to achieve his goals is probably why he's got partner, and the extra motivation his insults give is reflected in the double strike. But to be honest, the lifelink here is a bit confusing. I mean, like, what's going on there? I don't often gain vampiric abilities or heal myself when someone swears at me. I think we can only give Bruce a D at best, maybe a C. I mean, he's good where he's good, but there are some pretty serious missteps. And I guess that's the line that we're going to end on. I mean, a lot of A's here, and a lot of C's, not too many F's. It seems like the cards on Zendikar do a pretty good job of mirroring what their characters do in the story for the most part, which is pretty inspiring. I mean, Magic the Gathering, recently, it's been having some troubles doing that. I mean, Spice8Rack's video on the Planeswalker cards for More of the Spark shows that almost half of them are doing things that just never happen in the story, and that's a bit of a shame. But the connection between lore and cardboard was a lot stronger back on Zendikar, and hopefully it'll be stronger again when we return. This video was made with the help of our wonderful patrons, which include the generous Tolaris. If you want to see more videos like this, I suppose you could contribute to that Patreon. I mean, honestly, the deeply motivating, knowing that if I don't make videos, people are giving me money and I'd be letting them down. Also, we've got a Discord where some chat happens, so if you like this kind of nonsense, feel free to join that. That's in the description too. I'm Connor. These images are provided by Jack. You've been watching Building Better Dungeons. Safe home.